These are the workers who have played a most important role in creating the American heritage, who have created much of the wealth of this nation. This is a story of steelworkers, workers who have literally made the steel that built America. It is a story of their struggle to achieve what was promised them as part of the American dream, a struggle for dignity, happiness, well-being, and control over their own lives. It is a struggle that's been played out between workers and management on the shop floor, in the community, and at all levels of government. The struggle has never been more than temporarily resolved. Most pronounced during periods of economic and political change, it has at times been open and hostile, and at other times hidden and restrained. But its impact has been felt deeply by workers, families, and communities. With roots stretching to the beginnings of the industry, the struggle continues today.
I mean, there's no two questions about it. It's an industrial holocaust. It might not be the same type of holocaust you had in World War II or the same type of holocaust you experienced during a volcano or during an earthquake. It might be in slow motion, but it's a holocaust nonetheless. It's destroying families, it's destroying people's lives, it's destroying our future, and it's destroying America.
These are unemployed and laid-off steelworkers in the Monongahela Valley, the area around Pittsburgh that was the birthplace of American steel. Their employers say company profits are being squeezed by intense worldwide competition and a global recession. The company says it needs to install new technology and increase productivity, and it says its workers receive too much money and receive too many benefits for it to remain profitable enough and competitive. These workers are angry because they are losing their place in the American dream. Yet it was less than 100 years ago, for some of the same reasons we've just mentioned, that steel workers were also fighting to keep their place in the mills and in their communities. Perhaps the biggest difference was the industry then was beginning a period of incredible growth instead of a period of incredible decline. It is the night of July 5th, 1892, in the town of Homestead, near Pittsburgh. Locked-out workers from the Homestead mill are keeping a vigilant watch for the arrival of Pinkerton detectives hired as strikebreakers by the Carnegie Steel Company. The sides have been clearly drawn. In the weeks preceding the strike, the company had built a fortress-like fence around the mill. Now, the workers have been locked out for nearly a week. The confrontation is about power, a struggle for control of the mills. The making of iron and steel in the 1800s was a process controlled almost entirely by the workers. According to Yale historian David Montgomery,
management of the mills, for the most part, left the direction of the key production operations in the hands of the skilled workers because they had no choice. The skilled workers knew how to do it and how to direct others around them. But these very same people were also figures of great importance in community life, tended to be those who would organize social affairs, picnics, parades, singing societies, sporting clubs, and so forth in the towns where they lived, and the people who formed the first union in the iron and steel industry.
The Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers was an exclusive but powerful craft union. And if laborers and unskilled workers couldn't belong to the union, they were still protected by the skilled workers' control over production. The mostly native-born members of the Amalgamated used their skills and the union to obtain high wages, reasonable hours, and control over their work in the mills. Demand for steel by the late 1800s had grown incredibly. Cities were building skyscrapers, and railroads were opening new markets. But for Andrew Carnegie, the combination of increasing competition from many small steel producers and a recession meant that profits were dropping. The solution, Carnegie felt, was to increase productivity, lower wages, continue mechanizing the mills with new technology, and above all else, gain control of the production process. But there was one major obstacle: the union. While an organizing drive at some of the newer mills had been beaten back by the late 1880s, it was in a confrontation with Carnegie that the union would face the most crucial test of its strength.
Carnegie Works in Homestead was the last really large iron and steel mill in which the union still had a firm grip. If they could hold on there, they could possibly expand into the rest of the industry. If they were wiped out there, then for all practical purposes, the union would be finished in the iron and steel industry.
It was June 25, 1892, when the Carnegie Steel Company declared that since most of its mills were non-union, the spirit of democracy dictated that all of its mills should be non-union, and workers should accept wage cuts of up to 53%. Carnegie sailed for his castle in Europe, and the workers were locked out of the mill on June 30th. Company manager Henry Clay Frick was left in charge, and he sought to operate the mills by hiring Pinkerton detectives as strikebreakers. But for Frick, the battle wasn't so easily won.
Come all ye hardy working men of iron and of steel, and listen to these few lines while I tell you how I feel about those homestead strikers who so bravely fought and fell to defeat the dirty Pinkertons on the tugboat Little Bill. On the 6th day of July, my boys, the news is spread all o'er that 300 dirty Pinkertons had landed on our shore. But like armor plates we met them, and with hearts so hard as steel, we made them seek for shelter under the tugboat's driving wheel. When at last they cried for mercy, our leader said, "Hold on. To kill these dogs would be no use, and maybe 'twould be wrong. But we'll let them run the gauntlet, each man to doff his hat, and then we'll have them out of town, and very quick at that." Now the Homestead men, long life to them, they're still upon the field, and like their loyal comrades, they will die before they yield. They now have peace and harmony, though the mills are idle still. The Pinkertons won't bother them, nor the tugboat Little Bill.
Homestead, typical of mill towns in the late 1800s, was a community controlled by its workers. The strike was supported by the townspeople, clergy, press, and businessmen. But the defeat of the Pinkertons was only one battle, as a lockout became a drawn-out war. Frick gained the support of the governor, as the state militia took control of Homestead from the workers. Court decisions were won against the union. Public opinion began to shift away from the workers when a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman attempted to assassinate Frick in support of the workers' cause. And there was little the workers could do when these strikebreakers, protected by the militia, began operating the mills. The fact that they could operate the mills with the help of technology installed in the early 1890s signaled the end of the Amalgamated's control of the production process. It was the vast wealth of the Carnegie Steel Company, aided by the power of the state, which wrenched control of the mill in town from the workers. The strike ended nearly 5 months after it began. Many workers were blacklisted as strike leaders were placed on trial. With the union in shambles, workers were left to deal as individuals with what soon would be the largest corporation in the world. The Amalgamated would try some organizing efforts again, but its efforts would be futile in the face of the dawning of the era of the giant steel truss.
O almighty Andrew, philanthropist, library, Carnegie, who art in America and not in Europe, spending the money of your slaves and serfs, thou art a good father to the people of Pittsburgh, Homestead, and Beaver Falls. We hail thy name as Steel King of the world. We bow down before thee in humble obedience of slavery. When thou sayest before a banquet of nabobs that the laboring man of America wants more than the average laboring man of other countries, thou sayest what is right. We will starve our wives and families, work ourselves to death, sacrifice our homes, crucify liberty, kill prosperity to all but you. But we will never go back on you so long as we have no labor organization. We are unorganized, and you can deal with us like a lot of sheep of the dark stripe.
The strike in 1892 highlighted a fundamental change that was happening in the workplace. Sparked by economic crises and changes in the marketplace, management took control of the production process through the very rapid introduction of machines. This changed the organization of work, a process which economist David Gordon calls the homogenization of the workforce.
We argue that the process of homogenization began slowly to gain force in the period of crisis itself, in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. We argue that homogenization involved mechanization, the reduction of job requirements to a kind of common semi-skilled denominator, growth in establishment size to accommodate the capital equipment that was part of the mechanization process, and the emergence of what was sometimes called the foreman's empire. The foreman became very important as firm size grew in administering this new system of relatively more homogeneous, de-skilled working environments.
It meant that the mills by the early 20th century were becoming rapidly larger and larger, with enormous numbers of workers concentrated in them, and as many as 40 to 50% of those workers doing nothing but pushing and pulling things around and shoveling things around that mill at the time. This means that, first of all then, the common laborers were going to be workers of decisive importance for, say, unionizing efforts of 1919. It means, secondly, that the industry could make extremely large use of workers of rural peasant origins from Europe to carry on that work. They may never have been in a steel mill, but they were strong. They were determined to earn what they could.
The size of the new firms allowed employers to create strategies that undermined worker unity. Artificial job ladders created divisions among the workers, as did a strategy of pitting one worker against another through racial and ethnic divide and conquer. With no labor representation, masses of immigrant workers with limited job skills worked 10 or 14-hour days and 24-hour weekend shifts for low wages under the iron rule of the foreman. Outside the mills, the company used police and informers to stifle dissent amid the squalor of ethnic and class segregation and neglected public services. While fathers and sons worked in the mills, wives and daughters did never-ending work to supplement their meager incomes by providing for boarders who lived in their cramped homes. Their labor brought tremendous growth to the Carnegie Iron and Steel Company, which became the United States Steel Corporation in 1901 when it was bought by J.P. Morgan. It was the first billion-dollar corporation. Protected by a stiff import tariff, by 1906, U.S. Steel controlled 70% of the American market and exported steel abroad as well. Its workers toiled in miserable, unsafe, and polluted conditions, while its owners enjoyed the fruits of an unprecedented concentration of wealth and power. The dream of the early producer movement, such as the Knights of Labor and the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers for an egalitarian society with an equitable distribution of wealth, had faded. In its place, business trusts, seeking to consolidate their wealth and power, told the nation that their increased wealth would benefit everyone, especially if the political system created a good business climate. With William McKinley in Washington and U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh, a new order had triumphed.
Help me give our land a golden goose. We can turn our native corporations loose. The working folk will go the extra mile, and we'll have power to the people corporate style, and we'll have government on horseback again, back to the days when congressmen were men.
With the arrival of World War I, demand was greater than ever for American steel as the industry's markets and monopolistic power expanded even further. Lucrative government contracts benefited the industry as Homestead became a center for the production of armor plate. For the workers, the war period held out the possibility for their conditions to improve. Their expectations rose as they saw an increase in the demand for workers and the need for continuous production. The rhetoric of President Wilson told them that they were Americans with the right to subscribe to the American dream. Author Jeremy Brecker notes their expectations could be seen in scattered pockets of militancy.
There were spontaneous mass marches that would start at one plant and they would march down the valleys and go to the other plants and call out workers there, and eventually they would have workers from many, many plants on huge mass marches.
To try and calm down this militancy, the government moved in after the U.S. had declared war and forced the employers to give the workers some major concessions, to promise them what's called a basic 8-hour day. Now, people who were working 12 hours a day were considered to have 4 hours overtime. But at least someday it was down on paper. Someday we're supposed to get a real 8-hour day.
But when it became obvious at the end of the war that the tremendous profits of the industry would not be translated into improvements for its workers, instead, they were faced with rising unemployment and inflation. Demands were intensified for ending the 12-hour day, the right to unionize, and for workplace democracy.
A basic notion that had two parts to it. One, that we who work in the factory are the ones who would know best how to direct and manage our own affairs and our own needs. And secondly, the employers and financiers who are running these mills are making a mess of them, of our lives, and of the country as a whole. So therefore, let's replace them with better people like us.
But the environment of the period was extremely repressive, in stark contrast
to defeat the unions in the 1890s and in 1901, and then to keep them beaten in the years thereafter. The employers became very much aware that the local municipal authorities were of decisive importance. It became important to get local authorities who would not only create what you call a friendly business atmosphere in the borough, but as part of that friendly business atmosphere, would see to it that there was no agitation to rock the boat in town.
You have a situation where anybody attempting to organize unions or even talk unions would not only be blacklisted, but certainly vulnerable to direct violence.
As they said in Homestead, if you want to talk in Homestead, you talk to yourself.
But the workers, especially the less skilled Eastern and Southern Europeans, could not be subdued. The ferment of the rank and file prompted the American Federation of Labor to set up the National Committee to organize iron and steel workers, which would, for the first time, coordinate the activities of many small craft unions in an all-out drive to organize the industry.
What is important here is that this committee realized then that the old formula of organizing skilled craft one at a time had to be put aside. It realized, secondly, that they had to try and get everybody involved in unionizing at once, and third, that they had to pay special attention to the immigrant workers who made up the great bulk of the laborers and unskilled, semi-skilled workers in the mills themselves.
The organizing drive was especially successful in the Pittsburgh area, particularly among the immigrant steelworkers.
One phrase that kept coming up again and again and again was "no more horse." We've been living, they would say, all these years like a horse. It's taken out of the stable, worked all day, put back into the stable at night and told to go to sleep. I'm not a horse, I'm a man.
300,000 workers went on strike in August of 1919. But despite their enthusiasm, their position really couldn't have been worse. The issues of the strike were turned into a question of resisting the Bolshevik threat by Judge Elbert Gary, the head of U.S. Steel and spokesperson for the industry. Newspaper ads pounded the workers to return to the mills as the vast wealth of the industry allowed it to withstand the strike. Local governments supported the industry, while state and coal and iron police rampaged through steel towns. The workers, lacking financial resources, did not receive enough help from the National Committee.
We were also severely hurt by the fact that the skilled workers didn't stick, that they were still regarded enough of a separate group in their consciousness and in their role in the plant and in the community, so that while there were lots of cases of skilled workers participating in the strike and supporting it, on the whole, after a certain amount of time, they began going back.
By Thanksgiving, defeat was evident. In January, the strike had officially ended.
We have been forced into a fight, a war with the rich right here in our own country. These streets belong to us. As we march today, think about what Frederick Douglass said, who fought against slavery. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to love freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are the men who want crops without plowing the land. They want rain without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand.
Although the goals of the 1919 strike had not been achieved, it did achieve unprecedented ethnic working-class solidarity and set the stage for the end of the 12-hour day.
1923, the economy picked up, the steel industry picked up again. And again, leaflets started being handed out around the steel mills by both the AFL and the IWW for another organizing drive. It was in that context that President Harding called upon the employers in the steel industry to get rid of the 12-hour day and institute an 8-hour day. And finally, by great public pressures, managed to convince the industry to make at least an official switch. A lot of workers were still working more than 8 hours, but to make an official switch to the 8-hour day in 1923.
But even so, there's no doubt that the industry had withstood the first major challenge to its power in the 20th century. The dramatic technological changes that occurred in the steel industry between the late 1800s and the early part of this century allowed the industry to take control over the shop floor. But the changes in the workplace were not caused by the changes in technology. Changes in the organization of work historically have resulted from struggles between corporations and workers, sparked by periods of economic crisis and change.
In periods of economic crisis, the problems of resolving economic instability are so great that, among other consequences, they carry with them and require changes in the organization of production. And the second point, which both follows from the first and I think is more important politically, is that the character of those changes that take place, the content of those structural transformations, is a product of the efforts or input or struggles of both sides in the production process.
Gordon argues major structural changes in the organization of work have occurred 3 times in the United States. In the first period, during the rise of the factory system in the mid-1800s, workers found themselves in large factory settings, but the way work was organized changed very little. This early period of initial proletarianization lasted in steel until the economic crises of the 1870s and 80s. As industrialists sought new forms to maintain their profits, they struggled with their workers, and the earlier organization of work gave way to the process we've called the homogenization of the workforce.
The vistas for consolidation, industrial consolidation as it was called, were now open, and the labor problems had to be solved through the lockout at Homestead. As you obviously know, Carnegie solved his labor problems, and it was the period of the 1890s when, to a very large degree, firms all across the country were trying to remove the final barriers, whatever they were, inefficient production, the strength of craft unions, which stood in the way of beginning to transform labor.
The new order continued well past the strike in 1919. The organization of work did not change. While the workers certainly wanted their condition to improve, their organization was ineffective, and there was no economic crisis. There would be no change until the employers would once again find their profits falling.
U.S. Steel has thrown away the book. We no longer play by the rules when you're working for U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel is out to lie, cheat, and steal our lives. We have no choice but to fight them in the streets, to fight them in the plants, and to keep up that fight until they give us the jobs that we need to live.
The decade of the 1920s is usually seen as a period of complacency in American society, the Roaring Twenties. But many industrial workers experienced the period as the lean years. Any lingering complacency quickly slipped into despair in the late 20s when the Great Depression shut down the American economy. Steel output dropped by nearly 40% as steelmakers laid off more than half of their workforce. Many who were lucky enough to keep their jobs worked only 2 or 3 days a month. Wages were cut, then cut again. By 1933, laborers were back to their 1923 wage, $4.30 for a 10-hour day. U.S. Steel distributed food boxes to the unemployed, but made the men sign IOUs. The apparent complacency of the 1920s masked a political atmosphere that remained extremely repressive. In Homestead, it was said that workers could still only talk to themselves. But in the wake of the 1919 strike, an undercurrent of labor activism also existed within the shell of the old Amalgamated and within other groups. Sociologist Phil Neiden says it was this activism that would eventually unite to challenge the power of the steel masters.
In a sense, there was a sort of undercurrent during this period of time that occasionally popped up in recognizable organizations, but found it difficult to do so until, again, the 30s, when there's much more support from other industries, and just the whole political mood clearly had changed in the country during the 1930s.
The battle was by no means easy, but this time the steelworkers had some help.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
Milltown residents had voted overwhelmingly for Franklin Roosevelt, and his election gave them confidence and courage. They continued to work within unemployed committees and the steel and metalworkers industrial unions set up by the Communist Party. Some revived their amalgamated association lodges and tried, without much luck, to prod the timid national officers of the amalgamated into action.
People like President Michael Tighe, who would simply say that it's absurd to try and go on strike against the steel industry because, look, I have been a trade unionist for 50 years, and every time I've gone on strike, I've lost.
The rank and file also said goodbye to their company unions, which had been set up by the industry to beat the government's guarantee of the right to organize. But the companies were not about to give up their control. They resorted to their familiar tactics. Organizers were labeled communist and outside agitators. And if that didn't work, they beat them up and threw them in jail.
As late as 1934, Mrs. Perkins, Secretary of Labor of the United States, went to Homestead to explain to workers their rights to collective bargaining under the National Industrial Recovery Act. And she was banned from holding a meeting in the town. You had to get up early in the morning to stay ahead of Mrs. Perkins. Of course, she used federal property and spoke from the steps of the post office to the workers who assembled. But if the Secretary of Labor of the United States had to resort to such techniques, you get some idea of what the atmosphere was like in towns of this sort.
But the federal government's strong support of the right to unionize and the formation of John L. Lewis as CIO gave the workers hope. Many mill towns saw their first labor rallies in decades, and the failure of craft unionism of 1919 would not be repeated.
Indeed, by the 1930s, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee went one step beyond, making a coalition of crafts and set up one industrial union to recruit everybody. It was clear that the steelworkers themselves, by that point, wanted nothing more to do with craft forms of organization.
The Steelworkers Organizing Committee was established in June of 1936 by Lewis and the CIO. It was headed by Philip Murray. The industry's anti-SWAC newspaper ads and other efforts to undermine the goal of getting every worker to sign a union card backfired. Instead, it strengthened the workers' resolve. On July 5th, 1936, at a rally in Homestead, they announced their intentions to the world with a Declaration of Independence. After that, organizing continued at a frenzied pace. The local people with SWAC organizers and resources were unstoppable.
When John L. Lewis set up the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, it simply turned to the people who'd been active in those caucuses of rank-and-file activists, commissioned them to be organizers, and they were in business. They had the folks to operate with.
Following the repressive period of the first part of the century, steelworkers not only found an improving political climate, but assistance from the community, fraternal lodges, and some progressive clergy, like Monsignor Charles Owen Rice.
The mill towns were beginning to find their freedom. They were beginning to elect Democrats, and they were beginning to get rid of tyrannical police chiefs. And I would hear them grumbling, in the old days a man could be fired or hired or totally on what the boss thought of him. There was no sense of freedom, of really independence of the free American worker, blue-collar worker as we have him today. And it was gradually coming in the 30s, and the time was ripe.
We have a tradition in this country that changes get made by the people, by those people that are willing to stand up for what they believe, by those people that are willing to go out in the streets for what they believe, by those people that are willing to commit civil disobedience for what they believe. That's how every change in this country has ever been made.
So we have to build a whole movement in this country, like Solidarity in Poland, for example, to put forward a set of demands that are going to meet the people's needs.
In March 1937, the United States Steel Corporation recognized the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. Other companies continued to resist SWAC organizing attempts, and violence erupted. But by the early 1940s, nearly the entire industry was within the fold of the CIO, signaling the beginning of a new era, and finally, a better life for the steelworker.
And this is Frank Mele, a friend of mine. Frank came here from Italy 45 years ago. He's got his own place up on the hill. Come Christmas, it's full up with his children and grandchildren. Frank doesn't talk much, but I know how he feels about his home, his kids, and the satisfaction he gets knowing they'll grow up with the same chance as the kids next door or any other kids in the country.
The coming of World War II put a hold on most parts of American life.
A city is literally being wiped out before your eyes.
Only one thing mattered: winning the war. Steelworkers, bound by a no-strike pledge and urged on by business and government appeals to patriotism, threw themselves into wartime production. For the first time, women in large numbers entered the steel mills. Steel companies made big profits, but pay increases for workers were limited by government wage controls. But lots of overtime provided most with big increases over Depression-era paydays. The federal government spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build steel plants, which were handed over to the companies at the end of the war. In Homestead, nearly 8,000 residents lost their homes, churches, schools, and stores to make way for expansion, a process that narrowed the tax base of the town. The war finally ended in August of 1945. But the years of violence had destroyed the economies of Europe and Japan. Undamaged, the United States emerged from the war as the economic, political, and military leader of the world.
The United States steel industry at the end of World War II was preeminent in the world. Much of the steel industry had been virtually destroyed through Allied bombing and through German bombing, and therefore the United States steel industry was the only major one around.
The austerity of the war period was followed by an unprecedented economic boom in the United States.
So savings, pent-up demand, the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the export boom, in part because of the Marshall Plan, gave us a period of time in which we had unparalleled expansion in the economy and unparalleled profits. Now, as a result of that boom, one would expect that other parts of the community besides big business would want their share of the pie. And indeed, that is precisely what happened.
Steelworkers demanded a share of the boom in 1946 with a nationwide steel strike.
When you think about what the steelworkers made at that time, my husband started out working as a laborer in 1941 at 59 cents an hour. 59 cents 1 hour.
The steelworkers, feeling that they had worked and sacrificed during the war while the companies had made huge profits and then were hit with the inflation that followed the removal of price controls, demanded an 18.5 cent an hour pay raise and no price increases by the companies. The plan was backed by the Truman administration, but the steel firms balked, saying that higher wages caused inflation and that they would have to raise their prices. Backed by support in their communities, the wage increase was eventually granted the workers, and the companies raised their prices.
I guess the reason for the support of the strike was that the steelworkers had been patriotic, and they felt that they had done their duty, and now it was time to get what was due to them.
Workers continued to make wage and benefit gains, but they weren't won easily. Following the strike in 1946, there were strikes in 49, 52, 55, and 56 before the last industry-wide strike in 1959.
Across the country, smoke begins to pour from mills idle and silent during the 116-day steel strike. 500,000 workers began returning to their jobs after the Supreme Court upheld a Taft-Hartley Act injunction 8-1. Also going back to work were 350,000 in allied industries made idle by the strike. But it will be from 4 to 6 weeks before major new shipments can be made from the reactivated mills, and even then the nation's economy will not be out of the doldrums unless steel labor and management have reached agreement. Settlement of the dispute brings jubilation to all America. Reportedly, the 30-month pact has benefits totaling some 39 cents an hour.
Although they were making big gains in real wages, workers began to lose some of the increased shop floor control they won in the early days of the union struggle. According to Gordon, the period of homogenization was giving way to the most recent era of segmentation. A new social contract was being forged between labor and management. The ability of companies to play one worker off against another in the early period of homogenization had led to union demands in the 30s for an institutionalized grievance system and promotions based on seniority. In doing so, workers were able to increase their influence on the shop floor.
U.S. Steel and the other companies fought back or responded to this by conceding on the front of the wage demands, but fighting like tigers for management control inside the mills themselves.
What unions got was a promise from the corporations that if they cooperated, that if they moved toward more cooperative collective bargaining, they would get rising real wages, improved employment security, and better working conditions. In return, what management got was the promise that the unions would turn back to the corporations a significant amount of the control that those corporations had over the organization of work. And that side of the truth got embodied in most major collective bargaining contracts in what are still called management rights clauses. And those management rights clauses say that everything not explicitly detailed in this contract is the sole province and prerogative of management.
The new truce, or new social contract, also meant that the top-heavy United Steelworkers Union would become less and less responsive to the rank and file.
Within that formula, the union and the industry developed closer and closer cooperation. In fact, there have been cycles. You don't know about it. David McDonald first, of course, said in the middle of the 1950s that he could really see nothing left for his union to do. They had accomplished all there was to be done, and would be celebrating the collaboration he had developed with the steel industry, the harmony that existed in that time.
As it became more apparent to rank and file members of the union that the leadership was starting to set policies and was favoring a centralized administration, that's when the split starts occurring.
This is the type of union we have. I've said many times on TV, our international's been in bed with the corporations for so long they should file for maternity benefits.
They're going to defend the company's interests, and I beg you or anybody else to find me one place anywhere in any magazine publication where United Steelworkers of America criticize U.S. Steel.
Rank-and-file dissidents protested their loss of power in the plants and union, but they were soon overshadowed by the atomic arms race, the war in Korea, and the anti-communist hysteria that had been building in the U.S. since the end of World War II.
The Motion Picture Industry Council offers its strength and support to any legally constituted body that has as its object the exposure and destruction of the International Communist Party conspiracy.
It was a very, very frightening period. We sort of felt that fascism was coming.
It kept many dissidents off balance. I mean, there were the very blatant items, blatant things happening where union leaders were kept from union office, just by accusation, were kept from union office.
It didn't matter that the Communist Party had played a major role in organizing for the CIO. The International Union joined right in the frenzy. Dissidents were kept busy, just trying to survive.
And what happened was, as soon as they did a job on the communists, there wasn't that leadership and militancy in the union.
The Red Scare of the 50s narrowed the focus of the American political system and undermined the ability of union dissidents to campaign for rank-and-file control. But the feeling of prosperity continued.
Styling verges on the spectacular, from air-scoop grills to the dramatically sweeping tail fins that dominate most of the 57 models.
However, international and domestic forces were at work which would undermine the prosperity to which America was becoming accustomed. By the early 1980s, the American steel industry, which had dominated the world only 30 years earlier, would be only a shadow of its former self. More than 150,000 steelworkers would be out of work, and the future would not be holding out the promise of the American dream.
People are losing homes, and more are doing what America said could never be done, losing hope. Starving's going on. The American dream has been turned into the American nightmares with job loss, families breaking up, and suicides. This is us. We are the unemployed.
The period of decline is usually traced to the late 1950s. The last nationwide steel strike in 1959 produced more union centralization and increased cooperation with the industry.
The lip service that was given before to rank and file and local workers is not quite as apparent after '59. Through most of the 1960s, up until the early 70s, wages remained relatively constant with some slight fluctuations. Working conditions, according to many workers that I've talked to, worsened in many cases, possibly because of the loss of local control, but just changing relationships between the industry and the union.
What we're dealing with today is a very complex organization with a top leadership that tends, when it's speaking about affairs of the steel industry, to speak much the same language that the management does.
Credibility of the parties had been established. People realized that accommodation would have to be made to market forces, at least somewhat. And we enjoyed, in 1962, 63, 65, and 68, I think, labor agreements that, while they exceeded productivity improvement, were moderate viewed against other settlements in our economy.
Recognizing that foreign steel was beginning to have an impact, the industry pressured the government for import restrictions and trigger price mechanisms. But little else was done. The workers continued to keep the industry the most profitable in the world. However, by the late 60s, and despite a decade of labor peace, the industry continued to worry about a strike.
We began to see in the marketing sector that it sometimes didn't matter whether we had a strike or not, that just the possibility was devastating to steel markets and to domestic steel.
In 1973, the union formalized its no-strike approach with the industry by adopting the Experimental Negotiating Agreement, or ENA.
If we couldn't reach agreement, that we would put our disputes before an impartial umpire, or a panel of 3 impartial umpires. We did this in 1974, 1977, 1980 negotiations. We followed this procedure. We felt that we were entitled to, if we were going to forego and give up our bargaining power, so to speak, to negotiate for decent standards of living by means of the old economic force, that we were entitled to some minimum guarantees. And we didn't look on them, and no one else in the economy did in those days, as being very extravagant. Cost of living adjustment clause, and a 3% average annual increase.
When hard times arrive, it is working people who feel cuts in pay and standard of living first. With the recession of the mid-1970s, the period of prosperity ended. The social contract of the post-war period was undermined as thousands of plant closings threw hundreds of thousands of workers out of jobs. The economic downturn endangered the gains of blacks, other minorities, and women, and came at a time when segmentation of labor produced a wide gap between union and non-union workers, which undermined labor solidarity. Dissident groups within the steel industry, mostly dormant since the 50s, began to re-emerge as concern mounted about the state of the union and American steel. One of the most successful challenges to the centralized power of the union and its closeness to the industry was mounted by Chicago District 31 Director Ed Sadlowski and the organization Steelworkers Fight Back. Attacking the union's dues structure, its lack of democracy, and the failure of the ENA to provide employment security, Sadlowski campaigned for the presidency of the union. He ran against Lloyd McBride, who was supported by the International and outgoing President I.W. Abel. But the Sadlowski campaign may have been more charismatic than it was programmatic.
They certainly talked about democracy in the union. They did talk about discrimination, although some people criticize him for not talking enough about that. He did deal to some extent with the state of the industry and the need to maintain employment in the industry, but perhaps is not as well thought through as it could be. I think that largely Sadlowski's campaign relied on his personality.
According to Neiden, Sadlowski would probably have been successful in the 1960s. Despite criticisms that the Sadlowski camp itself was too centralized and failed to use local rank-and-file networks, he won the election in basic steel locals, but not among the majority of the union's members.
The number of basic steel workers was already on decline. There were fewer and fewer basic steel workers in the 1970s, which has clearly become much more dramatic in the 1980s. But the appeal of Sadlowski was to those basic steel workers. So he was appealing to a declining section of the union.
So the existing union policies continued, including the harmonious relationship with industry management. But by the late 70s, harmony was far from what was happening. Massive steel closings rocked the Mahoning Valley around Youngstown, Ohio from 1977 until 1979. Some 10,000 workers lost their jobs in 3 waves of closings. 3 days after U.S. Steel announced the closing of its Youngstown works, outraged workers who had been promised the plant would remain open if they made it profitable occupied U.S. Steel headquarters in downtown Pittsburgh. They had made it profitable, but still found themselves without work. The lack of support from the federal government and the loss of a court case based on the promises of some U.S. Steel executives to keep the plant open doomed an attempt to purchase some of the mills and operate them as a worker community enterprise. The employees were represented by attorney Stoughton Lind.
Stoughton took the case to court and he presented it, and the judge said, yeah, you're right, this is horrible what they're doing. Yeah, you're right, this is just morally not right. He said, but it's U.S. Steel's God-given right to shut facilities down, and that's the law, so we don't care how many people it screws and how many communities it destroys, that's the law.
3,500 U.S. steelworkers were left jobless in an area of hopelessly high unemployment. Tens of thousands of steelworkers would continue to see their once secure jobs disappear. The corporation that once commanded more than 70% of the market in steel declined as profit and shareholder concerns became more important than workers' lives and communities.
1,200 acres of land, a community of able hands, available right now. We're sending a message to the world. We're sending a message to the world. We're sending a message to the world.
Faced with stiff worldwide competition and overcapacity, the American steel industry is seemingly unable to meet the challenges of the present. But the problem itself has roots extending to the end of World War II and America's seemingly invincible world position. By the 1960s, the economic dominance of the United States was being challenged by the rebuilt European and Japanese economies.
Similarly, the Third World didn't lie down and play dead, and there were initial hints at rebellion throughout the 50s and early 60s. With Vietnam, with, in fact, the failure in some ways of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba to do anything about the change of regime there, a signal kind of went out that it was possible to challenge U.S. international economic power.
Riding high on the profits and market position it had commanded since the end of the war, American Steel suffered from inertia on the part of its managers. There was a focus on profits in the short run and a failure to see declining markets as the auto, appliance, and container sectors faded. And as other nations introduced new steelmaking techniques, the U.S. industry retained its increasingly outmoded technology.
The only new integrated works built during the 50s was the Fairless Works of U.S. Steel, which was built on the East Coast in part to invade Bethlehem's markets. In the investment decisions made in this period, there was an emphasis on using known technology rather than taking risks in investing in new kinds of technology. For instance, most new furnaces built were the
corporations had decided to try and compete with the Europeans and the Japanese back in the 1960s. They could have begun to implement the new technologies, which would have been much more productive than the technologies they've been using. The result would be, I think, is that the U.S. steel industry would be much more viable today. We'd have more work in the steel industry here, and in fact, we would not have forfeited our steel industry to the steel industries of our competition.
The industry also suffered from growing layers of management and shop floor supervisory personnel. The backgrounds of managers shifted from a technical focus, such as engineering, to training in finance and law. The consequences of all this produced devastation for steelworkers and their communities as conglomeration, mergers, and paper entrepreneurialism triumphed.
And I can assure you that U.S. Steel's plans for now and in the future are solidly linked into that plant that's called Homestead, and it's named after this barrel.
After
from Duquesne. I have 3 children. Like most of the women I work with in the United States still, they all have to work at, at the mill. That's the best paying job you could get with, seniority, everything. And here I was a waitress. And I can't go back to that because once the mills like they are now, everything is hurting. Every business around here is hurting in Homestead, everything.
The closing of the Youngstown plants was followed by another wave of closings in the Pittsburgh area in the early 1980s. Of 28,650 steelworkers employed in the Mon Valley in July of 1979, fewer than 11,000 remained on the job by December of 1982. In the larger 4-county area around Pittsburgh, employment dropped from 90,000 to about 40,000. The effects of the closings plunged the Mon Valley into depression-like conditions not seen since the 1930s. Soon, several worker activist groups emerged, fighting to save jobs and communities. One of the groups that took up the challenge was Local 1397 at the once mighty Homestead Mill, where by 1983, 5,000 of the local 7,000 members were out of work. Dissidents had begun to emerge again at Homestead during the Sadlowski campaign era, led by Michelle McMills and John Ingersoll. McMills began publication of a feisty rank-and-file newspaper which voiced frustration with the union and the corporation for their cooperative relationship that sacrificed the interest of the workers, especially blacks and women. The local became involved in the Youngstown shutdown, accusing the International of abandoning its members' attempts to save their jobs in favor of the corporation. In 1979, the dissidents came to power at 1397 with the election of Ron Wiesen as president, a man who minced no words with U.S. Steel or the International in fighting for his membership.
I think we all know that 1397 is a militant union. We're fighting militant corporations. It's about time we take our gloves off and take these bastards on.
Most of the groups in the Mon Valley are trying to develop plans for salvaging the area from its economic disaster. But meeting the immediate needs of the unemployed has been a primary concern. With unemployment benefits running out and welfare cut off for able-bodied persons in Pennsylvania, simply making sure that families had enough to eat became a major focus. In April of 1982, 1397 co-sponsored a benefit concert to raise money for its food bank with a local radio station and the cooperation of several local bands.
Everybody that I talk to knows that this is happening. Whether they're coming or not, they know that this is going on. And they know about the food bank, and they know about the efforts of these people here tonight.
Nobody put us off. Nobody said, well, we'll think about it. They said, well, yeah, if this is for people who can't eat, who were lied to by their employers because evidently U.S. Steel didn't tell these people that their jobs will not be back. So a lot of these people stuck around waiting, and now they have no money. So, some of these people are not very fortunate.
More and more food banks sprang up around the valley until even the International Union hopped on the bandwagon, sponsoring a visit of Screen Actors Guild President Ed Asner.
It's a shame in this so-called land of plenty. We are faced with insufficient jobs, and as dramatized by this program, insufficient food.
As conditions worsened, the Mon Valley Unemployed Committee held demonstrations for extending unemployment benefits.
Who needs to re-qualify for UC? Who needs a freeze on mortgage foreclosures? Who needs a freeze on rent increases? Who needs a freeze when utilities shut off? Who needs a relief from forced job searches? All right.
Shortly after the committee staged a sit-in at the Capitol in Washington, Congress voted for a temporary extension. As hundreds of people began losing their homes to mortgage foreclosures, the Mon Valley Committee accompanied people to lending institutions, advising homeowners of their rights. Using 1930s-style tactics, sheriff sales were disrupted as cardboard vultures were held over the heads of speculators. Eventually, a moratorium was declared on the sales, and the committee helped draft state legislation that provided some relief. As conditions worsened, more and more groups responded in the Pittsburgh region. From the Tri-State Conference on Steel to Beaver Valley Fight Back to the Network to Save the Mon Valley to the Save Our Neighborhoods Coalition. But most were aware that short-term emergency solutions were not enough to combat something much larger.
So, just what I can see, it seems like it's all greed. And we've written a song called Greed, which will be part of the show tonight, which spelled out our real feelings about it. We feel that the almighty buck means a lot more than people's 20, 30 years in a mill and things like that. We don't dig that at all. You know, I'm not a steel worker. I cannot see that happening. It's just not fair.
When President Reagan visited Pittsburgh, thousands of unemployed workers were on hand, both protesting his policies and hoping for help from the government. Without pausing to speak to the desperate people on the streets, Reagan addressed a group of government, business, and labor leaders at a conference on the dislocated worker.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mr. David Roderick.
In his speech, Reagan offered a limited program for job retraining and tax incentives for businesses who would hire the long-term unemployed, while defending his trickle-down economic policies.
The mill or the plant had always been open, perhaps even since their father's or their grandfather's day, and they assumed it would always be that way. Their employers represented America's strength and vitality as an economic power. How could the major employer in the town, the very lifeblood of the town, close its gates and lock its doors? This was as inconceivable as the town itself closing down. But we know the plant can close, no matter how essential it is to the employees and the townspeople. We know that America's economic strengths change and grow in different directions, sometimes without regard to the people who serve the old industries. This is called the free market, and it's what gives our children and their children an economic future.
It was clear that the government would take little action to help the unemployed of the Mon Valley, and that corporate strategies to maintain profits would continue without government interference.
Well, I don't like crying, but I'm not denying that these times are hard. We don't have much time left to take drastic action, just save our jobs. So come on, Mr. President, won't you help us? Won't you lend a hand? How can you be cold and be so heartless not to understand? Have mercy, it's been a long time ago. It's been a long time. And the time's come that we have to make a stand. I will fight for what I've worked my whole life to have. 'Cause I'm drowning in the sea of sorrows for the promised land. Well, it's been a while since I've seen men smile in this Pittsburgh town. Unemployment is rising, the people are crying, there's no jobs around. My bills are rising while my children go hungry and my world falls down. 20 years in the mill, I can still remember number one steel town. Pittsburgh, it's been a long time ago. It's been a long time ago. It's been a long time.
In the mid-1960s, when the American steel industry first felt the combined effects of its antiquated facilities and stiffer foreign competition, it sought import quotas and trigger price mechanisms from the government and the ENA from the union, rather than investing its profits in modernization. This strategy reduced the industry's profits in the 1970s.
The result was a strategy of capital mobility. We found that in the 1970s, firms decided that the way they could maximize their profits was to do everything they possibly could to cut their costs. And this meant move. It meant move to the south, it meant move abroad, It meant taking capital out of the steel industry and trying to buy up other industries.
Corporations like United States Steel, which up until 10 or 15 years ago had 70% of all its operations in steel, have raced to become more diversified.
The money for diversification has come not only from profits diverted from modernization, but also from the government and workers. According to Bluestone and Bennett Harrison, in 1978, U.S. Steel paid only $8 million in federal taxes on net profits of $250 million, and the year before paid no taxes, and in fact received $36 million in tax credits. Arguing that it needed more money for modernization, it pushed for a number of government programs, including an accelerated depreciation package passed by the Reagan administration. But attorney Stoughton Lynn points out that there were no strings attached to how the money would be spent.
But there's not a word in the bill, to my knowledge, which would prevent U.S. Steel from taking those bucks that would otherwise be paid in taxes and using them to build downtown skyscrapers and chemical plants in Texas.
The industry also sought relief from environmental legislation. A 1981 consent decree allowed the industry to delay its pollution expenditures if it used the money saved from modernization. But in the case of Homestead, they used the legislation to shut down an open hearth. Arguing that Congress had passed a measure to save jobs, 1397 attempted without success to stop the closing in the courts. Only a short time earlier, U.S. Steel found $6.5 billion to buy Marathon Oil in its most spectacular move to diversify.
Why then Marathon Oil? Because steel is not as profitable as oil or downtown real estate or chemicals or a variety of other ways to invest one's capital.
The industry also sought money from its workers and got industry-wide concessions with the 1983 contract. The agreement provided for savings of almost $3 billion from temporary wage cuts, the loss of a week of vacation, and the sacrifice of a special extra vacation.
As a result of these concessions, we're hopeful that we will be able to keep more companies in business.
No sooner had the new contract taken effect when U.S. Steel announced another massive shutdown to take effect on April 1st, 1984. By now, the pattern was clear. The need for extensive recapitalization, coupled with high interest rates, low profit margins, and an overriding concern for short-term profits, meant the industry would not finance modernization with money from the private sector. And money from the government, community, and workers would only be spent on investments to please stockholders by enhancing profitability. As a result, the future of the American steel industry hangs in the balance.
Ultimately, and despite the fact that it sometimes sounds harsh, nobody will invest where there is not an opportunity to earn a competitive return. The other side of that coin is if that opportunity is there, I think we can be sure that investment will continue. As far as U.S. Steel is concerned, I think our Mon Valley employees are a little bit vulnerable at the moment unless we can find the money for a first-class caster.
You know, we say that they made their money off our backs, they put it in diversified industries, they helped put us out of work. I say what we have to do is take over these plants.
One of the most outspoken critics of the industry and the International, Wiesen and 1397 have repeatedly taken them both to court, fighting for life in the industry and the International's lack of support for the rank and file.
Local 1397 continues to fight the company and the International to save our jobs. And as long as I am president, we will continue to do so. Thank you.
The local has challenged the International for help on the shop floor as antiquated grievance procedures cracked in the face of job combinations and deteriorating workplace conditions. Uncommon labor solidarity has also been shown for other locals and community groups. With a platform of cutting union executive salaries to rank-and-file levels, allowing the rank-and-file to vote on contract proposals, a moratorium on concessions, restrictions on job cuts, and the resurrection of militancy within the USW, Wiesen was drafted by nearly 100 local presidents across the country to run for the union presidency. Opposed by the International, he was unable to gain sufficient support for a place on the ballot. But there is no doubt that 1397 will continue the fight.
We are taking militant corporations on, and the union better become more militant. We're going to have to go back out in the street like we did in 1930, take our gloves off, and take these bastards on. The crooked politicians, the corporations, and the banking industry, because they're all putting us out of work. And the only way we're going to be able to accomplish anything is to mobilize all these unions into one and shut this whole country down, to show these politicians that we're still the most powerful voting force in this country.
Among the groups that 1397 has supported is the Denominational Mission Strategy, a group of activist ministers attempting to focus attention on the effects of corporate disinvestment.
If you watch the news tonight, evidently U.S. Steel said they'd stay in Pennsylvania as long as it was profitable. Well, we say people cannot be put out on the streets because of those policies, willy-nilly.
In a carefully laid out plan, the ministers first called upon local and state politicians to declare the Mon Valley an economic disaster area, eligible for government relief. When that failed, they went to about 50 corporations for help. Finally, with no response from the government or business, the ministers acted to empower the people. They set out to get 25,000 pledges that people would move their money from banks in the Mon Valley, which supported disinvestment and failed to use local deposits to offset the economic crisis in their own areas.
It's time to act and to move the money if we're going to get the relief that we need for this valley. If you agree with this, I'd like you to stand up and cheer and applaud.
This is Disinvestment Day. The churches are here, gathered with our union brothers.
The ministers began a campaign against Mellon Bank, citing its foreign investments and the generations of Mon Valley depositors that had made its profits possible.
We are putting out a call here for every distressed community, for every industrial community, for every area of the Northeast in this country that has a big bank that is investing in foreign companies and cheap labor, to do the same thing we're doing right here and to join with us and to stand together and to let that bank know we're not going to pull a leaf off a tree, we're going to shake the whole tree. Is that right?
About $100,000 was withdrawn on D-Day, hurting Mellon's image more than its assets. The bank angrily responded that it lived up to its good neighbor slogan and decried confrontational tactics in a newspaper advertisement. Only a few days later, DMS lost the financial backing of local church hierarchies, but the ministers continued on. Soon, Mellon Bank officials at various branches were living with the smell of dead fish and safety deposit boxes, and business stalled as tellers changed endless rolls of pennies. The ministers hoped that the bank's concern for its image would cause it to use its own massive power to push for job-producing changes and help save the depression-ridden valley.
Every bit of agitation we make and every bit of disrespect for the wisdom of the financial powers that we can engender, we're that much closer to a solution.
The cost of disinvestment and diversification extend well beyond the ledger sheets used to make corporate decisions. U.S. Steel may be moving towards a 20% rate of return, but corporate figures do not reflect the human price being paid, which, according to Johns Hopkins University sociologist M. Harvey Brenner, is quite staggering.
A 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, let's say that it moves from 8 to 9% or 9 to 10%, is associated with a 2% increase in the mortality rate, approximately that for cardiovascular mortality, somewhere between 5 and 6% for the homicide rate, something around 5% or so for imprisonment, about 3 to 4% for first admissions to mental hospitals, about 5 or 6% for the infant mortality rate.
And the dollar cost that extend beyond private ledger sheets are also quite massive.
We now recognize, according to Bureau of Economic Analysis studies, that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, we lose somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 to $80 billion in output, We lose something in the neighborhood of $25 billion in tax revenues. We spend somewhere between $4 and $5 billion extra dollars on unemployment compensation and food stamps and AFDC and other forms of public welfare. Indeed, if the unemployment rate today were 3 percentage points lower, we would eliminate about half of the federal deficit.
All of this, the economic crisis and the corporate response to it, means that tens of thousands of people have lost their part in the American dream.
In the steel industry, the typical steel worker who's permanently dislocated from that industry ends up with 46% less income in terms of earnings 2 years later.
Some people point to the development of high-tech industries and the service sector as replacements for the old industrial base. But economic growth depending on these two areas will most likely result in extreme polarization of incomes within the economy. And in any case, neither alternative offers hope for the displaced worker with 20 or 30 years in the mill or plant.
The industries that are growing most rapidly today are at the one end of the economy, the high-tech sector. It's not growing anywhere near fast enough to put America back to work, but it is growing. And at the other end of the economy, we continue to have very rapid growth in the service and retail trade jobs. The problem, however, is that with the decline of the major industries in the middle of the economy, from steel and auto to textiles and apparel, we're losing the core of the economy and instead creating, on the one hand, jobs that pay for some people, particularly the very highest skilled workers, relatively high wage jobs with decent fringe benefits. And at the other end of the economy, jobs that pay very, very low wages, often just minimum wages, and offer almost no fringe benefits. The result of such a polarized income distribution is that whole chunks of our community are downwardly mobile. That is, their lives, their standard of living are declining rather than increasing.
People are still losing homes, and families who rent are being evicted. And they don't have any place to go. Utilities are being shut off daily, and families have no food to feed their children. That's right. Hey, right.
J. Bruce Johnston and Barry Bluestone differ on the responsibility of government and labor for the current crisis in American steel. Johnston criticizes government for its tax, trade, and regulatory policies and labor for its high wages. He calls for a period of economic austerity so steel can be rebuilt. Bluestone, however, notes that other countries with competitive industry have strenuous pollution guidelines, that workers in other countries, especially Europe, receive wages comparable to those of the American steelworker, and that the federal government has helped American steel. He also disagrees with the need for a period of austerity.
Fact of the matter is that any country like ours, the whole standard of living is based on being able to maximize productivity in industries like steel and use those increases in productivity in order to be able to provide a high standard of living. If we were to cut the wage and the fringe benefit package across the board in all of our key industries, that would not increase our standard of living, that would decrease our standard of living, and it would do very little to increase our competitive position relative to other countries.
I worked 40 hours a week, didn't work any overtime, didn't work less than 40 hours a week. I'm job class 5, I'm an average steel worker, and I made $22,000 last year. How can anybody in their right mind say I make too much money or more money than the average person? I make $22,000.
What does the future hold for the Mon Valleys and America's industrial workforce? Is their future to be described as the working poor? Will a few escape and become some of the lucky ones? More government help for steel has been called for, as well as a period of austerity. But there's little evidence that the needs of the future can be met by those who have created disaster in the present. America is at a crucial crossroads. Should we continue to pour our resources into trying to reestablish our predominant economic and military strength around the world? Or do we find some new forms that meet human needs?
We need to develop a reindustrialization mechanism which is key to increasing our standard of living and maintaining job security and providing for those people who, for one reason or another, cannot find and keep jobs in the private or public sector.
What is being called for in opposing the capital shortage theory or the need for austerity is providing people with more involvement and control over the economy. A democratic alternative that includes full employment, greater workplace democracy, popular control of investment decisions, and more effective mechanisms to ensure useful and not wasted national output.
The thread running through all of the proposals that I think many of us would now encourage is that we see the difference between the very much more centralized decision-making directions in which large corporations have been pushing us for years, and the very high costs involved in those centralized decision-making mechanisms. So we now spend in the private sector $1, 20 cents out of every dollar of our expenditures, or 20 cents out of every dollar of revenues in the private sector, goes to the salaries of managerial and supervisory personnel.
The proposals for reindustrializing America come from a wide range of perspectives, but most take into account the central needs of the society with some level of national coordination, while decentralizing much of the decision-making process to a point where local input can become a reality. Steel is a case in point. It meets many of the central needs of an industrial society, and there's no reason to believe that steel cannot be profitably produced in America.
Steel is a very important basic material, and to let the American steel industry shut down, indeed on the West Coast we are very close to losing literally all of our basic steel-making capacity, would be a mistake. It would, among other things, leave us vulnerable to an international oligopoly of steelmakers that will be very strong in the future. Secondly, the major problems of competitiveness in the U.S. steel industry have not to do, in my mind, with higher material and labor costs, but with the lagging productivity of the industry. The productivity problems are embedded in the outdated machinery and equipment of the industry.
If the private investment criteria of the existing steel industry will not allow enough profit for it to remain in steel, why not let those who are most directly affected have some input into their futures?
In Weirton, West Virginia last night,
On our own, we're on our way.
townsfolk having themselves a big celebration. The joyous occasion, they bought the steel plant that is the town's main source of income. If they hadn't, the owners would have shut it down.
One community worker ownership approach has been through the Employee Stock Option Plan, or ESOP, where workers and communities provide the capital to buy out plants threatened with closing. But under such plans, control rarely lies with the workers. Unlike normal investments, those who lend the money remain in control of decisions until the long-term debt is paid off. In Pittsburgh, the Tri-State Conference on Steel, with its roots in the Youngstown closings, is working on a plan for a Steel Valley Authority that would use its power of eminent domain to take over the mills and restructure them to where they would become economically viable.
The proposal that Tri-State is making is what could generally be called eminent domain for the people. It's a switch, it's an attempt to use this public power in a way which will truly benefit the public by maintaining stable communities and maintaining jobs which are currently in existence.
The idea of using eminent domain has gradually evolved into a sophisticated vision for saving homes and communities in the Mon Valley and beyond. One person who has worked on the plan is sociologist Bob Erickson, who stresses that the form of the authority must result from democratic community input and result in an industry controlled by workers and communities.
The funding of the rebuilding would come from the federal government, from worker contributions, from local communities, but the Steel Valley or Mon Valley Authority would be a mechanism by which community residents and workers would be able to democratically make the decisions necessary for rebuilding the industry and their communities.
Pointing out that the Tennessee Valley Authority and Conrail are examples of publicly owned enterprises succeeding where private industry has failed, Tri-State believes the investment would pay off in the long run.
It's a tremendous future for steel. One of the things America has to do is simply rebuild its decaying infrastructure, its sewer systems, its bridges, its roads. Ideally, it should rebuild its industry as well. And if it begins to rebuild itself, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel will be needed every month in the Mon Valley.
Admittedly, the steel industry of the future will not look like the industry of the past. More and more products use components that are not made out of steel. But while there is a need for new socially useful employment for displaced workers, there's also a need for new forms in the workplace.
One of the things that people have to look at in a Steel Valley Authority is that people probably should not work more than 30 hours a week, that the job should be shared, so that everyone has a right to a job and that there's a job for everyone that needs one.
If the Steel Valley Authority becomes reality, it would give to the workers and communities something they haven't had since the arrival of the industry a century ago: control over their lives and futures.
There's a wisdom that says, and it's being bandied about more and more, it's okay to have 4%, 8%, 22%, 26%, in the Mon Valley, 50% unemployment. That's okay. That's the cost of doing business. And we stand in redeeming criticism of that. Full employment is the foundation of a just economic policy.
The struggle to implement democratic economic alternatives across the country will not be simple. Community alliances must be formed, and where they exist, reinforced. In organized labor, there's much potential if it is realized.
There is very substantial potential within the organized labor movement for substantial turnaround in the role that it's played in the post-war period. There's enormous disaffection on the part of rank and file in many unions with the stance that their leadership has taken.
To push for change requires support among and for all groups who have had only marginal participation within the economy: women, blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities, as well as the poor and members of the middle class concerned about their communities. The ongoing revolution in technology, transportation, and communications has also meant corporations see the whole world as a production platform. As the steel industry in Europe and Japan faces competition from third world countries, where workers' conditions and wages are no better than those of American workers 80 years ago, it is important to know that workers everywhere are at the mercy of the same kinds of forces. In Germany, for example, where the economy and investment decisions are linked very closely to the United States, nearly 250,000 steelworkers are currently laid off.
We are, in fact, in a global factory situation, and just as workers in different parts of the country in the same industry learn to come together and create something like the CIO, we have to learn how workers in different parts of the world who are working for the same companies, working in the same industries, have same basic interests, and especially we're being played against each other, can come together and do that. It's not going to be an easy job.
But as we see the internationalization of production, the flight of capital from steel, the erosion of the American dream as steelworkers are told they've demanded too much by taking home $22,000 or $25,000 a year to raise their families, we must remember that these are all products of an economic crisis in which the economic pie is being redivided. But as in every other period where there's been a major economic crisis and a resulting change in the organization of work, there is also the hope for a better life in this one.
A structure organizing production and structuring labor market operations, which worked well for a time, for the period from the late 40s through the late 1960s, has been decaying, as we put it in our book, is no longer working. There is now a period of economic crisis in the country, and part of the resolution of that crisis will require, one way or another, whether large capitalist corporations succeed in restoring their power or whether we move in some other promising directions. One way or another, we will have to reconstitute the organization of production. And if the history we tell is any guide, that process will involve both corporations and workers, and its outcome will depend on both their relative strength and on their clarity and imagination.
Let us revive the spirit of 1892. It is up to us to fight for our jobs, and if we don't start soon, the American steelworker will be extinct. We are an endangered species.
Well, they give
me the news as I walked through the door. They said to go on home, we won't need you here no more. Well, they melted the tools, and now the furnace is cold. Oh, the story of the Steel Valley has got to be told. Oh, we believed in the lies, we believed the stories that they told about working hard, about getting your just reward. Well, now we're out on the streets, they took away our homes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill burning my eyes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill telling me lies. Now we're looking around us, we see the shape we're in. Did our best, but it wasn't good enough. And now we're trying to find reasons for the life we live. Running fast, and we're running out of love. Oh, we believed in the lies, we believed the stories that they told about working hard, about getting your just reward. Oh, now we're out on the streets, they took away our homes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill burning my eyes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill telling me lies. In the lies, we believe the stories that they told about working hard, about getting your just reward. Well, now we're out on the streets, they took away our homes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill telling me lies. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill burning my eyes. Ain't no smoke from the steel mill telling me lies.
This program has been supported in part by the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, a statewide organization funded partially by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It does not necessarily express the views of the Council or the endowment.